Welcome to a special 12-part feature of the Holy Healthy Christian Moms podcast, the Wellness Legacy series. We are so excited to share with you the stories of our guests and believe they will give you hope and encouragement, especially if you're going through a similar trial right now. We want you to know you are not alone. God sees you and hears you, and our prayer is that He will use this series to remind you of that in a very tangible way. Today we have with us Dianna Kubacz. She's a homeschooling mom to 4 children, a family practice physician who works part-time alongside her husband at Loveless Family Medicine, a former full-time cross-cultural worker with TEAM, the Evangelical Alliance Mission, who now works part-time for TEAM as an associate spiritual care facilitator. Dianna is learning to live a joyful and present life through receiving the Lord's invitations to abide each day. So thank you for being with us today, Dianna.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Okay. So we just like to jump right in. So give us a brief overview of who you are, about your family, and a fun fact.
Okay. So I'm a South Carolina native, which is where I also am at the moment. But if I had to say how would I like to be defined or introduced, it is as a beloved of God who's learning to live each day, knowing that I'm loved by Him. So my husband and I, we married about 17 years ago while we were in medical school. We're continuing to work as family physicians now here in South Carolina. Over our years together, our family's grown from a size of 2 to 6. Our oldest daughter just turned 12. We have a son who's 8, and he's the only boy. Our second daughter will turn 6 next week, and then our youngest is 3. An interesting fact, which y'all invited me to share, I think it's interesting. So our first 3 children were born on 3 different continents, just because that's what our life was doing in that season. So North America, Europe, and Africa. And after sojourning, like with medical ministry, with TEAM, as you mentioned, the Evangelical Alliance Mission, we've found our way back to South Carolina and landed in Newberry County just before COVID, so December of 2019. And that's where we joined up with Lovely Family Medicine. So it's a small town practice, privately owned, that is really committed to providing compassionate care for the glory of God. And so I'm excited I get to do that alongside my husband and do it part-time, so I can still be a homeschool mom to my children in our home.
So fun to hear that. So where in Europe did you live?
We were in France, so we went to French language school for a year because we were headed to French-speaking Africa.
Okay, so where in Africa were you then?
Chad, which is Central Africa.
Okay, so fun. So I had the opportunity to live in England when I was in high school. And I guess technically I've been to Africa, like the Canary Islands, but it's like off the continent. But
Yeah.
So fun to hear that. I always love like international stories, just because that's been part of it. So yeah, that's amazing to claim like, or that your kids, 3 of your kids get to say they were, in different continents. That's
I didn't
awesome.
realize that about number 3, that he was born in Africa.
Yes, yeah, Hadassah was Africa. So Simeon was France, Hadassah was Africa.
I love that. I love that. And I'm so happy that the Lord brought you to Newberry County because we do a lot of life together, and our kids
Yes.
really enjoy each other. And I'm so thankful for that. So Andrea, I'm going to punt it back over to you.
Yeah. So we would love for you to share kind of that piece of the struggle. We've asked all of our guests this, like, so what was your story like maybe before a turning point that you had? And we'll just turn it over to you and see where the Lord leads us.
Okay. Yeah, as I think about that question, just what really has been the struggle for me, I would summarize that I struggle to live in, like, to feel God's I love you. And what I mean by that is I struggle to live in such a way that what I believe in my head, like what I confess with my confessional statements of faith, that matches what I really feel and sense in my heart. That emotional part of me that, like, do I feel loved? So I grew up in the church as a child. Like, I knew that the Bible said God loves me. I clung to that with like confessional tenacity, right? Like, yes, God loves me. But what I didn't realize was somewhere deep, like in my subconscious core, there was this treadmill of anxiety that kept me really striving and performing, so I'd be reassured that God was pleased with me. So I lived with this strong desire to please God and found joy, or what I thought was joy, in how well I was obediently living my life for God. So that looked like, I would describe it now, it looked like living life like as if there was this long checklist, a record of my actions, my reactions, my thoughts, and I was striving to get it all right. Not in a sense to earn like my salvation, but just in this sense of that's how I was reassured and could soothe that ache and know, like, oh yeah, I am loved. Because the ache is what kept me anxious about, am I enough? Am I acceptable just as I am? So that was that's how I'd sum up my struggle, is just that how to calm that treadmill and like live in that assurance, feel that assurance.
Yeah. So much of that resonates. I'm like, that definitely was me. It was like there was this line between my head and my heart, like that needed to be broken. And yeah, I love it. Before I became a believer, or like just as God was transitioning me, I was like, it would be so much easier to be Jewish or Amish because of that checklist thing. But yeah, so you mentioned the like there was that kind of treadmill of anxiety. So what kind of on the surface, how was that manifesting? Or like what would that cause you to do that was kind of like visible?
Yeah, so I think on the surface, to a lot of people who interacted with me, I just looked organized and together, and there's all this affirmation, so it kept me on the treadmill. And I don't know that I think it looked very healthy to a lot of people, and so that made me think, okay, this is how you live. Where it surfaced that I started to have realization from someone else that this wasn't healthy, is get married. And to my husband, it looked like rigidity. It looked like she's not okay if the plans change. Like, things need to be really controlled. Things need to be really scheduled. We need, does that make sense? It came off looking very perfectionistic, very ritualistic. And that could even translate as legalistic, but that's what it looked like.
So, as you were in this state of turmoil, essentially, of the lists and affirmations and the anxiety, excuse me, and things like that, how did that feel in your core?
So in my core, there was this tension. Like, I didn't like that feeling of anxiety, right? I didn't like that feel. I would feel it in my gut. Like, I didn't like that feeling in my gut. And so I'd want to soothe it. And so I could soothe it by performing well, or exercise, or something that would release some kind of endorphin or something, so that I would feel better. And so at the end of the day, it would be reviewing and be like, oh yeah, I did a good job. And like, humbly, I would say. And it's like, there was this humility to it. It was just this tangled web and mess, is really what it felt like. Yeah, and a lot of insecurity. I would say it just felt like a lot of insecurity, even though from the outside it looked like I had so much to be secure in. Like, to so many other people, it looked like, how on earth would she be insecure? Right? Like, because things seem to be going so well. But on the inside, it was just like, how do I keep this up?
Yeah. I think that there are definitely women out there who are listening to this that can resonate with that, because our audience is ambitious women, and ambitious women can very easily fall into that place of striving and doing and perfectionism. And then that banter that we hear from the world, that, oh, wow, I don't know how you do it all. Oh, that's just so great. Thank you so much for all you're doing. And so then it kind of feeds this narrative in our head. Well, they're thanking me for it, so this must be really good. And even in the church, it can be a very slippery slope, because there's so many opportunities to serve, and we can sometimes overserve, instead of coming to church, coming to worship, coming to community, being able to be refilled and to be humble in our weaknesses.
As you were saying that, Erin, too, just God brought the phrase, like, it's almost like we can serve ourselves to death. And it might not literally be a physical death. I mean, it could lead that way, but even it's like this dying of our soul, not our spirit, but our soul in some way, like that. Yeah. And yeah, Dianna, like everything you're saying, I'm like, yes, like it's like pretty much my story too. And how that showed up. And I love that you said, like, it's so cool how God uses our relationships, like it's, our marriage, or even as a mom, like where he uses those to kind of say, hey, I kind of see this going on here, like, let's bring it to the surface. I'm curious, like, what was there a defining moment when you actually knew something had to change, where God was like, okay, Dianna, like, let's deal with this?
There's definitely a moment in the sense of a season. And it was these moments where I finally realized I can't do this anymore. There are too many new things: marriage, parenting, living cross-culturally, practicing medicine in a resource limited setting. I don't know how to perform well anymore. I don't even understand what the expectations are anymore. I don't know how to go out and greet appropriately. I don't know how to speak appropriately. I don't know how to, correct and encourage healthy behavior in my children appropriately. Like, just all these things that I started realizing, I don't know how to do this anymore. And I don't know how to get it right. And so there was then a shift, and I was like, okay, then I kind of set my sights on spiritual fruit. Like, so then I just craved joy and peace and patience and gentleness and self-control. I started craving those things and like begging God for them and striving for them, which to me was the only thing I knew how to do. It's you just strive for things. So I'm like striving for these fruit, begging for these fruit. And so I'll describe the moment as this image, because God gave this image that really opened my eyes and provided a shift. And the image is a tree. Like, I saw myself as a tree, and my mind's like the canopy of this tree, and it's looking out. It's a fruit-bearing tree. It's looking out at this branch, and it's like, pop out an apple, pop out an apple. It's getting like more stressed and more intense, like, pop out an apple, and no apples popping out. And through the image, I realized, like, no joke, Dianna, because like trees don't produce apples like that. There's not a brain up there saying, pop up an apple like an assembly line. And so he invited me to, like, let him show me through this image, like, what is the tree doing? Like, it's being present in its season, and it's just doing what it's designed to do. There's water, and it's drinking it up. There's sunlight in the spring, and it's like soaking it in. And so leaves are forming, and they're getting greener and stronger, and then buds are forming, and the bees like them, and they come and they drink and they pollinate, and then here comes the fruit, and it grows and it ripens, and in its season it's there. And what was this tree? Did it strive for any of that? Like, it was just being alive and being present and doing what God designed it to do, and the fruit naturally came. So that was the moment where I'm like, oh, right, I'm invited to be like a tree. So that was when I knew something had to change, but it just begged the question, well, how do I do that? I love the sound of abiding. Yes, sign me up. Now tell me how to do it, right? because I struggled with transitioning from doing this life of doing to this life of being. And it's like, well, I know how to do well, but do I know how to be well?
I think that's a beautiful imagery. I'm an imagery person too. And yeah, the trees don't just say, oh, today I want an apple on this branch at this time. And it's going to be symmetrical in every way. And it's going to taste sweet, but tart at the same time. Like the tree doesn't get to define if it's a Granny Smith or a, whatever, John a Gold apple. The tree is what the Lord creates it to be. However, the tree does need the right environment. Otherwise, the tree will not survive. So in that space, like what did that look like for you as you were shifting to a place of being well instead of doing well? Like what were the things that God was telling you needed to be well?
So God is gracious, and he gave me what I need, and he helped me to stop resisting it. And what I needed was the husband that I have, who is a man who has tasted of that love of God and the joy that comes, and who like fights to stay there. And I, in all of my treadmill of striving, found it very hard to hear that invitation and know how to respond. And so my husband really fought for us and put us in the places that gave me the space to start being able to unpack what was going on underneath. Like, why was that treadmill there? What was the motor behind it? For us, that looked like actually going for a 3-week, they called it like a rejuvenation and renewal, but it's at a place it's called Alongside. It's a ministry that's set up for pastors or missionaries like to come if they need to unpack some things. And there, it's where terminology of shame, like what is shame, and realizing for me, shame was the motor driving the treadmill. And that was the hurdle, that was really the biggest hurdle I had to get over to shift from doing to more of a life of being, and from a life for God, living a life for God, to living a life with God. And what I mean by that, like shame, it's a hard word to define. I mean, it put me through Alongside. I was invited to read some books by an author, Kurt Thompson, who I highly recommend, Christian psychiatrist. The Center for Being Known is an area where he shares a lot of his work. He's written 3 books, but one of them that was really crucial to this is called The Soul of Shame. And it's the second of his books. The first is The Anatomy of a Soul. I found them both fascinating. They really resonated, and they just brought some clarity to what I knew was this tension and this chaos inside of me, but I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to start unpacking it. And so through that, to realize what Wilder is his last name. James Wilder is someone that Kurt Thompson refers to as well. And James Wilder, in one of his books, describes like the difference between healthy shame and toxic shame. And so what I'm talking about is this toxic form of shame that by nature isolates us. So it was isolating me, and it just fed this self-perpetuating lie about my identity, that I wasn't enough, that I wasn't acceptable unless I performed well, and it just kept this cycle going.
Yeah, that I love that, because there are like there's symptoms. There are symptoms that show up. So something that resonates with a lot of people, not just women, is being overweight, especially in America. That's a symptom of something else. And so people attach it to, oh, I'm just tired, or I'm bored, or I'm emotional. But then, so that's kind of like the anxiety for you. but then you dug under that. And that's a lot of times people get stuck at that level of, oh, I'm just emotionally eating. I don't know why I can't stop.
Yeah.
Instead of digging underneath and really exposing those vulnerable places that sometimes we don't even know are there.
Yeah, and that's very much what happened, Erin. And so for me, my form of emotional eating is emotional not eating. So it's more of and that was something my husband became, it's just kind of like, hey, what's going on? Like, this isn't okay. And so there were symptoms, like there were clearly symptoms, not just the stress, not just the rigidity, but also I wasn't cared for my body well. And what But it's hard to look at. It was very hard for me to look at what was underneath, because I already knew it was some experiences that had happened to me in the past where I allowed shame to write a narrative about those experiences. And that's the only narrative that I believed about them. And so every time I'd even try to go there and revisit that experience, I would get this rush of I just felt shame. And if people are like, what does she mean? She felt shame. Like, that moment where like you look and realize, you lock eyes with that person who you care about, you have a relationship with, and you see in their eyes how your behavior has just ruptured this relationship, ruptured the trust, or ruptured something. And it hits you before words can even come. It's what you feel. And you want to turn your head away and you want to hide. It's Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, right? Bite the apple and they run and hide and they cover themselves. It's that feeling like I can't even bear to look. Like, that's what would happen if I even tried to visit like these memories. And what I realized through counseling, through what I was reading, is the only thing to do about shame is to be invited back to these relationships, is to be vulnerable. But I was so afraid, because I thought if I was vulnerable about these parts of me, it was just going to increase the shame, and I couldn't bear to think about that getting any more intense. But that place where he said, hey, when was that moment? It's like, I had to do something. And it's like, well, I guess I'll try doing something different, because what I'm reading is saying, hey, try this, be vulnerable. And so it was hard. But I started talking about, this event that I'm referring to, or these series of events, or even my struggle with an eating disorder. Like, even to talk about those things used to be so difficult. And I found that once I put it out there in a safe place with someone who really cared and wanted to listen, and they heard me, and they stayed with me, and they felt along with what I was feeling, I had a very new experience. And that was that God invited me to have a different narrative written over the experience. So did it erase the memory? No, I still have those memories. I still remember the events. But the narrative that is written over them, over those circumstances, is different now than that shame narrative I used to have. But I couldn't get there by myself. Like, it required this safe, healthy community, which I would love to say, and for us to experience, as that's God designed for the church. Like, the true healthy church community is that's that place where we can be invited for God to rewrite the narrative of these shame scripts that we're carrying around, that are the motors of our treadmills. And that impact is that background noise for me of this like self-contempt or self-loathing or I'm not enough or whatever, like that started to quiet down. Like, that motor on that treadmill started to get slower and less overwhelming. And the words I put to that is, I experienced joy. I felt joy, in the sense of defining joy as knowing that someone's glad to be with me. What I feel when I know that someone is glad to be with me. And I began to see that God is glad to be with me. Like, the true me the messy, just as I am me, I begin to feel that and like experience that versus just it being in my head. And I think that's because for so long, I was just trying to change the shame script of my head. I was just trying to replace that. Oh, God says I'm enough, so I really am enough. Oh, God says this is okay, so it really is okay. I was trying to replace the shame script, but I didn't have anything to replace the shame feeling. Like I was still feeling the shame, even while I was trying to have this healthier script, until I could have these experiences of joy that could then replace that like undercurrent. Because that's where shame really has its power, is like in that deeper feeling that we're carrying around.
Oh my gosh. Like literally tears are like welling up. Like it's just because Aaron and I see all the time like women and men in the body of Christ where it's like that shame narrative. It's almost like that image of like, I just need to hide and pile on all the fig leaves, right? And that fear, it's almost like that fear almost becomes a blanket around them that they think is protecting them. But I feel like what God's bringing to mind is just like the greatest level of freedom is on the other side of that fear, but you have to go through it. And God had brought me to a place too where he gave me the phrase like we have to go through it, kind of like that going on a bear hunt story, like that. Like literally I started crying in that, like when I was in a dark place, because I was like, oh, like I wanted God to take me around it, over it, like just jump to the other side. And he's like, no, you have to go through it. And it's hard and it's painful, but yeah, like so profound. So as we're drawing to a close with this, we always like to ask our guests, like, how have you seen God use this to establish a legacy of wellness for your family?
Yeah. This is like fresh blossoming fruit in our family, right? Because all this I'm describing is pretty recent life change. So the legacy of wellness that I hope is being established and that we're starting to lean into is for us to be a joy, like a family that lives in this environment of joy, as I've described it, just where we are glad to be with one another. And that I am willing to take that to whatever other emotion my kids might be feeling. So maybe one of them is sad or discouraged, but I can help bring some joy into that moment with them by just being glad to be with them in their sadness. I'm not telling them they have to change it, but like, so I'm hoping that's the legacy of wellness I can offer them, because I think that is what God offers to us, is to be glad to be with you and be present with you and pay attention to what is really going on.
What as you were sharing a lot of your story, what kept coming to my mind, Dianna, is the lost sheep, the parable of the lost sheep and his pursuit. And when we read that story, sometimes we can think, oh, that's the lost sheep who is heavy into whatever, and they're like way off. However, in a sense, you were the lost sheep with your narratives and the way you were thinking and the way that you were doing for God. And he just came after you and continued to pursue you and bring you back and invite you back to the table. And that's really important, I think, for our listeners to hear that we're all the one, that he wants to bring back. Just because we have on the outside, we look like we're, perfect, and we have this, we have that, and we can do this, and we can do that. That doesn't mean that we don't have these places that the Lord is deeply pursuing and coming after us. So I don't know, that just kept coming up. And I'm just so thankful that you turned around, because I know for me, you and your family are a huge blessing to me and to my children. And I know we've said this before, but one of yours, they just pour into my highly anxious oldest child and just I see these little pieces of what you're describing and how your children are showing up for my children, which then in turn affects the wellness legacy for my children and my grandchildren. So I just want to speak to that. So last question here. In a sentence or two, how would you like to encourage a mom who is in the place that you used to be in?
I encourage myself and other moms to be willing to stop in the moments where that treadmill is so strong and overwhelming, to just be willing to stop and allow our attention to be drawn back to moments that we remember deeply sensing and feeling God's I love you. Moments where we notice God noticing us, similar to what David does in the Psalms. That in a sense we're for ourselves having these joy moments that will allow our minds to steep in those moments where we're feeling overwhelmed, to invite joy back in to what we're experiencing. So we're living life with God, in relationship with Him, very presently.
So, you know what I'm thinking about with God. You want to share the name of the book?
Absolutely. The book is With. It's by Skye Jethani. I would highly recommend it for someone who wants to maybe look a little deeper into how they might be posturing themselves toward God. Like what type of posture may they be living out of in their relationship that they have with God.
Awesome.
And what type of relationship He is inviting us into.
Yeah. And he's always there and available. We just have to choose to enter in that space. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. And if anybody wants to know more about Dianna, Loveless Family Medicine, her ministry, all those things, just know that will be in the comments. And I know Dianna, and I know that if the Lord is leading you to reach out to her, just to be a person to pray with you or listen to you, she'll be happy to do that. So thank you so much for being with us today, Dianna.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thank you.